Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you to Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session is sponsored by Kotak. Thank you so much for tuning in on the second day of the online avatar of the 13th annual Mumbai International Literature Festival you are so fond of. This year, in its special combined format, we have 2 days of the online edition of the festival, which we started yesterday, and we have sessions continuing today too. And then, for those in and around Mumbai, remember you can join us for the physical edit of the festival opening at the NCPA on Friday 11th, and then on Saturday 12th and Sunday 13th, and then at the St. Paul's Institute and bookstore Tidal Waves, both in Bandra as well, on Saturday and Sunday. Check out the sessions and speakers scheduled on tatalitlive.in. And remember, I'm going to be there, so I'll be looking forward to seeing you all there in person too. Now, on to our very first online session for today. No Looking Back, the perilous pursuit of power and prosperity. Over his fascinating career as a writer, thinker, and essayist, Pankaj Mishra has written searing histories of colonialism and explored his concerns about a global pandemic of rage, populist revolt, and fanaticism. But in his first novel in 20 years, he found a deeper truth in the emotional lives of people trying to navigate the many upheavals of the 21st century. He says, there's become this obligation to reinvent yourself to survive this new world. You might have to give up languages or religions that you grew up with in order to become modern. Exploring these dilemmas today, we ask, how much of oneself does one have to leave behind, or lose, or destroy, while trying to clamber up the slippery ladder of wealth and success? And is the answer to cling on or let go? Let's get our speakers today on board to help us understand these paradoxes. Pankaj Mishra is the acclaimed author of more than 10 books of fiction and non-fiction, including Butter Chicken in Ludhiana, and most recently, Bland Fanatics and Run and Hide, his latest publication. He writes frequently for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Guardian, the New Yorker, the London Review of Books, Bloomberg View, among other American, British, and Indian publications. In 2009, he was nominated as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Please welcome Mr. Pankaj Mishra. Today, he will be in conversation with Sonal Shah, a freelance writer and editor currently based in New Delhi. She has led and been part of editorial teams at print and digital platforms in India and in New York. She writes on literature, language, food and drink, travel, the arts, urban life, and sometimes other stuff. Remember to contribute your questions for the Q&A at the end of the conversation by writing in your questions in the comment boxes of the platform that you are viewing us on at any time through the talk. And remember to write in your names as well. So now, over to you, Mr. Mishra and Mr. Shah. And remember, there's no looking back.
Hi, Pankaj. Hi, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Pankaj Mishra needs a very little introduction. He's a well-known writer and well-known essayist who has written such travelogue, everything from travelogue to novels to literary essays. Today, though, we're talking about his second novel, which has recently been published. So Run and Hide is his second novel since The Romantics in 1999. I'm going to just briefly give you an overview of the novel. It's a confessional, it's framed as a confessional letter from the narrator, Arun, who is a literary translator, to his ex-girlfriend, who's a sort of social media activist from a wealthy Muslim family and also a writer. So the woman is writing a secret history of globalization, which is centered on Arun's friends from IIT Delhi. One of them is Virendra, who is Arun's Dalit roommate. And he's a typical IIT success story. He makes it big in America before kind of losing it all. And the other central character in this group is Asim, who is a magazine publisher, kind of a louche, but very opinionated and loud-talking character who eventually kind of faces a different kind of downfall. So Arun's trajectory sort of takes him from a small village of Deoli to the dorms and barsatis and farmhouses of Delhi, to a small town Himachal, to London, and to a monastery near the Tibet border. But his journey is also an attempt to sort of understand himself as a man in New India. He flits between India's past and present, his memories, his ambitions. So I think we're going to enjoy talking about the title of the session is The Perilous Pursuit of Power and Prosperity. So we have a lot of things to talk about around that. So hi again, Pankaj, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. And thank you actually for that very insightful introduction to the novel.
Great. I enjoyed reading it, and I'm sure the viewers will enjoy it as well. So first, perhaps we could start with just talking, for the past 20 years, you've been writing essays, books of nonfiction, many of them centered around the idea of New India. Perhaps you could talk a bit about what it was like to return to fiction after so long. Did the timing of the pandemic play any kind of part, or were there other factors?
Well, I actually started it before the pandemic. The pandemic, obviously, the months of the lockdown were inadvertently a great boon because they allowed me to stay in one place. Otherwise, I would have been traveling and the novel would have been further postponed. But they allowed me to, sit at home and sort of focus on the story and the plotting and so on. The experience itself was, exhilarating in the sense that I hadn't written fiction seriously in a sustained way for a very long time, like, nearly 2 decades. So it was very exciting to go back to a certain mode of imaginative writing, where you did not feel constrained by the tyranny of facts or by the necessity of having to stick to facts all the time, which is, something I've been doing for the past 20 years. I could just, rove completely freely across, a pretty vast realm, both, intellectually and imaginatively and morally, look at all different kinds of characters, bring them all into a single frame. So I have to say, I mean, really, it was a kind of liberation, personal liberation for me to go back to this far more imaginative mode of thinking about the world.
And you've been sort of taking notes alongside, your reporting and analytical writing, and just these are things I can't include this in this essay, or this just doesn't work here, but this is something I really want to say. Was that the case?
Yes, there's something you said in your introduction, like, what is it to be a man? What is it to be a man in India, in a transformed India of the last 2 or 3 decades? And that is something I felt I had certainly not addressed in my fiction. I also felt perhaps I should read more widely, that subject had not been addressed in a lot of the cinema I had seen and a lot of books I had read, emerging from or about the new India. And I felt that this subject really does need to be tackled at some point or other. And so I was actually, making mental notes, if not, putting stuff down in my notebook or in my computer, all kinds of subjects that I felt could not be written about in nonfiction, certainly could not be written about with any degree of satisfaction. And those subjects really piled up over the years, and I thought in the end, it's only really fiction that can honor, that can acknowledge the complexity of many of the changes that have occurred in India in the last 2 decades, and especially the way in which self-images of men in particular have been altered, how they've come to taste a certain kind of power, a certain kind of material power, which was not available to their fathers or their grandfathers, and how intoxicating that experience of accumulating power has been for so many of us. So
That's
that
such an
is something
interesting
you know,
word. Yeah.
I could not really write about it in the essay form or nonfiction reportage form.
I'm going to come back to that word intoxicating. I think that's a very interesting word choice that you've used. I wanted to linger a bit longer on the question of writing fiction, because the novel does sort of, it's sort of a very interesting mix of fact and fiction. I mean, anyone who's familiar with certain worlds will recognize, you know, characters who are perhaps rooted, or aspects of them are rooted in reality. Of course, there are authors who cast, like V.S. Naipaul, who casts a long shadow on the book. Other references to authors like Stendhal or Arundhati Roy are also mentioned by name. And then some other literary references are kind of thinly veiled, like there's a sort of cheeky reference to The Sherry Drinkers, which is a book about Delhi's global elite, which, you know, I think some people will kind of get that reference. But then other things are completely invented. So how did you sort of balance drawing from life versus drawing from your imagination?
Well, I think when you write about the contemporary, this has always been the case wherever you are in the world. When you write about the contemporary moment, when you write about your peers, there is inevitably going to be a great deal of the real world somehow making its way into your fiction. And you know, I mean, there was no way I could avoid it. I mean, what I find really surprising is that the contemporary has not been looked at for such a long time in India. You know, why is it that you could rephrase the question? It says, why is it that fiction in English, which is something I'm aware of, maybe there is fiction in Hindi or some other language, which tackles this much more than fiction in English. But why has fiction in English not written about this new world that has grown up around fiction in English? You know, you've had that kind of self-consciousness in practically every other literature in the world, where the conditions of its production, the conditions of that literature's production are looked at, examined very closely. You know, in fact, you've had too much of that kind of novel in the United States or in England or in
Right.
France. The novel has come to suffer from excess of self-consciousness. But I felt that this whole world of, you know, literary festivals, of publishing houses, of people feeling, you know, disappointed by their you know, literary productions, or by the fate of the literary productions, these intensely competitive jealousies between writers, these different narratives, the modes in which people have sought to narrativize the new India, whether through nonfiction like the one that Alia in the novel is attempting, or the kind of grand social realist novel of the kind Asim, one of the other characters, is writing. I felt like we haven't really talked about the different ways in which we have tried to think about the new India, tried to write about the new India, and also at the same time try to connect what is happening in India to an increasingly lucrative international world of publishing and publicity. So in a way, you know, this is also a world that I've grown up in, and I thought, actually, this is a fascinating subject for fiction. And I've not even mentioned journalism here, which is such a big
Right.
thing that happened in India. You know, we know how journalism was completely transformed thanks to the arrival of television channels. How journalism became so much shriller, so much more aggressive, and at the same time, much more partisan.
And we're also seeing, you know, some of where journalism has come now with what's going on with, you know, the Wire case and everything. So it's a really fascinating adjacent subject, I guess. You chose to actually use for the central narrative. It's in a confessional sort of letter frame, and it's interesting. This sort of confessional mode is often kind of associated with the writing of women, and I think you've written before about how often the best sort of political writing is actually the most nuanced political writing is written by women who were participating in historical processes. Um, what was your thinking behind choosing that mode? It's a very interesting choice, and you know, it has shades of almost a religious confession, and but also this frame of a letter.
Mhm. There's a phrase that occurs towards the end of the novel, which is the shame of being a man. How can I describe the shame of being a man? The narrator says towards the end. And this is a phrase that actually came to me from something Primo Levi wrote, and he actually called it. He wrote, "The shame of being a human being." And I felt again that the narrative has to describe just how shameful it has been to be a man in India over the last three decades. So the entire confession aimed at a woman that the narrator has wronged grievously. Not only the narrator, but a close friend of the narrator has wronged in a particularly horrendous way. How does one explain these wrongs? Where are the men who committed these wrongs? Uh, where are these men made really? What are the particular conditions in which these mentalities are forged? And so I felt that only a form of a confession could really capture some of the mixed feelings of shame, guilt, regret, and and sort of, I think, just the sense that we've had it far too good for far too long, and we've actually really committed a lot of atrocities in the process, and there needs to be some accounting of those atrocities at this stage. The other
Yeah,
reason why I chose that, sorry.
no,
um,
there's an interesting tension there between this need to kind of speak one's experience, and also an attempt to sort of run and hide or efface oneself that the narrator kind of keeps running up against, right? He wants to explain where he's coming from, or understand, if not explain or justify, but understand where he and his, cohort sort of comes from. At the same time, he realizes it's sort of a form of indulgence as well. I mean, there's this constant apologizing to the woman he's writing to, and a constant kind of words don't do justice feeling in it. And that's something you've touched on in your writing about fiction, is the idea that not only novels or storytelling can actually capture transcendent truths and their way to escape a moralizing or judgmental tone. And yet the main thrust of this book is, how do you judge yourself? How do you judge others? By what measure? And how do you understand while not taking away from a kind of a moral judgment? So could you talk a bit about that tension?
Yes, I mean, I think, one of the things that the confession is trying to do is also to focus on certain things that Alia, the person the narrative is addressed to, is prone to overlook in her own book, because her social experience is extremely limited because of the privileged classes she belongs to, because of this very nomadic, extremely international existence that she has, that she's not really aware of the very specific social and physical settings in which the characters she wants to write about have been created. Their personalities have been forged in those particular settings. So he's trying to also explain at the same time their particular backgrounds of deprivation, not only material deprivation, but sexual deprivation, a certain kind of emotional torture that a lot of men have to undergo at a certain stage, even at highly prestigious institutions. And these are, again, things I feel like they're not talked about enough. The peculiar traumas suffered by men, which is not to justify any of their behavior, but just to remark on the extreme anomaly of the situation that many of these men lived through. So it's not just sort of straightforward judgment or straightforward moral assessment, but also an attempt to understand just how do personalities become so distorted. Why does power appear to so many people the only mode of redemption. Why does compassion, why do feelings of solidarity or compassion do not have the same value for these men? So it's also an attempt to understand, even though the confession is largely a mode, accommodating of the feeling of regret and repentance.
Yeah, that's correct. So stepping away from that a little bit, one of the things, or one of the areas where there is perhaps a bit of redemption, and one of the things I enjoyed most about the novel, are these very poetic descriptions of the natural world. I mean, one of the novel's, I think, most incandescent passages describes the passage of seasons in a small town in Himachal. And it's kind of set against the relationship between the narrator and his mother. It's really beautifully done. And throughout the book, there's sort of a juxtaposition between this wordless communication of the land and the sky and nature, and the kind of ugliness of human endeavor or striving. In fact, the book's final image actually encapsulates this tension really beautifully. Could you talk a bit about this contrast? Did you seek to restore a kind of nobility to striving, or reconnect it to a purpose? Or maybe just talk about the contrast between nature and human striving in your book.
Oh, that's very sensitively put. Thank you. I mean, I've always felt, and I certainly, when I'm reading, I respond to descriptions of nature, in the most bleakest of fictions, such as, for instance, Chekhov, where everything is falling apart. Characters are completely confused. People lead lives of great secret torment and indecision. But whenever he describes, sometimes very, very passingly, sometimes in great detail, the world of nature, the account of a journey or a particular landscape, the pages come alive. And again in Chekhov, you have a sort of reference to just how incredibly beautiful the world is, and yet how appallingly human beings behave in it. And this is a contrast over the years has become almost a constant in my own writing, that I've become very alert to, and especially living in Himachal, and making many of the same journeys that the narrator of this book makes. I've become extremely sensitive to just how incredible this landscape is, also the degree to which that landscape has been despoiled in recent years by big development projects and dam constructions and so on. Nevertheless, it remains there as a kind of standing reproach to the world that the human beings have made. And in one sense, I suppose it was inevitable that the book was also going to reproduce that sort of particular tension, as you describe it, between the ugliness of what goes on between human beings, the ugliness of what human beings inflict on nature, and this great stern majesty of the mountains, of these valleys, of this great sort of riverscapes, that remains intact year after year after year. And the seasons, I mean, again, if you go to Himachal from the plains, you're always very struck by, if you spend a whole year there, by just how seasons used to arrive. They still do to a certain extent, with a great deal of regularity, and they were clearly defined. Like there were 4 seasons in the year. You don't really have such a clear sense of that, if you're living in Allahabad or Delhi, for that matter.
No, I thought that was really, really well done, and I think it's something that it's not something you can explore so much in nonfiction. So it's lovely that you were able to stretch those muscles and kind of flex those that writing skill. That was, I think, one of the novel's most compelling parts. So going back to this idea that you talked about, the intoxicating New India, and how it connects directly to a kind of toxic masculinity, which the narrator draws a sort of thread between this, the way of being a man, and the loss of like a moral or a spiritual universe. he also draws a connection between morally sort of bankrupt, hollow men whose unreflective malehood disallowed the recognition of some vital truths. That's a quote. And also connects it or contrasts it perhaps to the emptiness of the self as conceived in Buddhist philosophy. And I know you've written a bit about Buddhist philosophy as well. Could you talk a bit about that connection, that emptiness, and also maybe address whether you feel literature can still connect people to a place and sort of imbue their lives again with meaning, to allow them to recognize those quote unquote vital truths.
I think, literature, the best of literature has always alerted us to um, the uncertain nature of the human self. It's always pushed back against any idea of human possibility or any vision of human beings that gives them too much power, too much control. And fiction has always tried to undermine that by showing human beings as fundamentally weak and uncertain, with a very unclear idea of who they are, privately always struggling for meaning, privately always struggling for self-definition, never quite arriving at a satisfactory self-definition, no matter how rich or famous. And I think, that's what fiction has done consistently, is sort of provide a sort of, glimpse into the tormented and confused inner lives of, of individuals. So it's always, in that sense, literature has always been Buddhistic, let's put it this way, that it has had a clear sense of just how contingent the human self is, and that there is no such thing as a unitary human self, that is always plural, it's always divided against itself. With the context of, in the context of India, I think, you know, I've been very struck by how quickly India, and by that I mean not just, small number of people, but a very large part of the population in India in the late 80s, from the late 1980s onwards, started to overthrow certain very Indian modes of existence, certain Indian worldviews, in which success was not a great value. Power was not a great value. In fact, renunciation was a greater value. And this is, very peculiar to cultures like India. You won't find them, for instance, in the United States. You would not find any mainstream philosophy in the United States that emphasizes renunciation. In India, a lot of mainstream philosophies, a lot of different religions uphold that value. And so for centuries and centuries, these worldviews have existed in India and they've exerted a great hold over our imaginations. And I've just been staggered by how quickly they were overthrown in the 90s and the 2000s, replaced by some incredibly tawdry fantasies of success and power, all, extremely kind of phrased and framed in hyper masculinist terms. So it's not surprising. I say to people that we have as a prime minister today a man who, is very much interested in projecting a hyper masculinist presence, and he's a sort of ideal prime minister for a country that essentially turned its back on centuries and centuries of a particular philosophical heritage, emphasizing patience and restraint and compassion, and embraced ideology of success and power and global triumph and so on and so forth. So it's something that I really wanted to explore. Just how did this change occur? What happened in the private lives of the men who were, I suppose in one sense in charge of this particular ideological and spiritual transition. And that's why I was interested in these men who came of age in the 1980s, because I think that was the crucial time. And then of course the liberalization of the Indian economy and the sort of what used to be called the unleashing of competitive instincts, of the so-called killer instinct. You're probably too young to remember this was a word commonly used by newspaper editorialists in the 1990s, that as Indians, we lack the killer instinct. Well, you'll end up in a terrible way with a whole lot of killers running your public life, but there is a straight line to be drawn between that aspiration and where we are today. And I feel like, again, I think fiction ought to, and is perhaps able to capture these very different ways of conceiving of human existence. And so, there are characters in the book who still subscribe to an older ethic, and there are characters who kind of really moved into the modern world at great speed and determination.
And interestingly, a lot of them move into the modern world, kind of co-opting that aesthetic. I mean, sort of co-opting that aesthetic, or co-opting the religious surroundings or context of that that gave rise to the idea of renunciation. So even with our dear leader, it's at the same time who's sort of embraced renunciation of a sort, going off to serve the country, leaving family behind, but espousing the very worst sort of values, and kind of creating a materialist philosophy out of something that was very much
Absolutely.
not. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's really important point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that actually most of the central characters don't really go in for, they have a fairly liberal outlook, I would say, given the spectrum of where India is today. But there are a lot of peripheral characters, like Arun's father, who's kind of there in the background, who gesture at the rise of Hindutva in India, and the kind of hyper masculinity that kind of comes along with it. And that's
Yeah,
interesting.
Sonal, I was actually, because I'd written about those kinds of characters so much in my nonfiction. The young man who embraces Hindu supremacism. There were so many people like that in my nonfiction, that I was very clear in my head that I had to write about something, or people far more interesting than that, which are essentially people on the liberal left, with all the right kind of ideas and opinions, but nevertheless, deeply compromised by the kind of, dominant ideology of the times. And I think there is at some point, one of the characters says that, maybe we're not so different from the Hindu crazies, that ambition and vanity have made us more alike. And I think, in many ways, I do think that's an important point, even though it's uttered by an unpleasant character in the novel, because I feel that, even people on the progressive left, or on the liberal left, have been guilty of promoting or embracing or embodying, these hypermasculinist ideologies in the past. Hindu supremacism is only one expression of those ideologies.
Not to mention, kind of reinforcing certain class structures that kind of are again run parallel to sort of religious supremacy. But yeah, there's a really great passage in the novel describing a party in London, and they're just snippets of dialogue that you kind of, it's actually probably one of the biggest chunks of dialogue in the novel. There's not a lot of spoken speech there, but it's really well deftly done, and I think you capture the contrast between social concerns of the liberal left and kind of the way people actually live who can afford to have those social concerns. I thought that was I mean, were any of those snippets kind of taken from life, or did you kind of wholly?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. I mean, over the years, I never go to parties, but even if you don't go to parties, you would at some point become privy to those conversations. And I think with my background, and with this particular life experience of mine, I've always been very struck by just how disconnected, how detached, even the very well-intentioned people on the liberal left are from, vast numbers of the human population in the world today. How an experience of privilege, an experience of, especially of metropolitan privilege, really does alienate you and really does put you in a little bubble where you can rehearse any number of, liberal left notions rhetorically, but actually you're not really called upon to do anything except proclaim them on social media or proclaim them in dinner parties. And when you are actually called upon to do something, you'll quickly assume a conventionally right-wing position. So this is,
There's no
this has been
renunciation involved really in that in that position. Yeah.
a,
You talked a bit about, you wanted to write about the generation that came of age in the 1980s and 90s particularly. And there's a sense in the book of sort of generational truth, almost borderline generational determinism, that when you were born in New India sort of plays a big part in the trajectory of your life. Um, it's kind of a historical analytical view, and I thought maybe you could talk a bit about, do you think those kinds of generational truths have become a bigger part of the way we understand our lives? Are they an important way to understand India's current moment?
Oh yes. Oh, that's a really important question, because I certainly felt that I was working with a certain generational experience. And something I learned from a novel of Flaubert, which is not much talked about, not as much talked about as, say, Madame Bovary, but that's Sentimental Education, where he set out very explicitly to write the story of a generation that experiences the revolution of 1848 and is bitterly disillusioned by it. So there are all these kind of particular landmarks, historical landmarks, in the lives of certain generations, and they shape how not the entire generation, but many members of that generation would experience the world at large, experience all kinds of different emotions. And I do feel, for a generation that came of age in the 1980s, the opening up of India to foreign investment, the liberalization of the economy, the arrival of new modes of entertainment and consumer products, of course, greater mobility, the fact that you didn't have to queue up for foreign exchange in
The
Delhi, and you could
telephone.
travel exactly and fill up forms and triplicate. You could travel all over the world. That really was a very particular experience for people who had previously known an incredibly austere existence in sort of pre-liberalization India. Obviously
I'm
people,
just
young
gonna
people,
sorry.
sorry.
We're gonna wrap this question and move to the audience Q&A. Yeah.
So like people like yourself, they would have grown up in an India that had already been transformed. So you probably didn't notice how different India was previously, how different the worldviews were as espoused in the press or on radio or on television, the things people said to each other. And I think, my generation was in a position to observe just how rapid and dramatic and devastating the transformations were.
I'm so flattered that you think I'm so young, but we're gonna move to the audience questions. We have a few questions from the audience. So first, we have a question from Radhika Rao. What do you think it would take? And this kind of maybe speaks to the previous question about generation. What do you think it would take for the type of people your main characters portray to feel a sense of acceptance and arrival post their success rather than perpetual alienation?
What will it take for them to?
Is there, I mean, I guess they're really asking, is there a way for these characters to accept themselves? It's a question that assumes that that's even possible, maybe.
I don't know. I mean, I think they would have to transform themselves pretty radically for that to happen. And I think that is not really possible for people beyond, a certain age. You can do that when you're in your 20s. You can perhaps do that with some when you're in your 30s, but I think in your 40s, you're pretty much set in your ways unless you experience some moment of revelation preceded by some moment of great trauma, and you realize that your life has been mostly error, and that it's time to rectify it. But that happens very, very rarely. And and also, so the social situations, political situations don't help, because we're all kind of forced into the defensive right now. So I think the time you need to work on yourself, on your inner self, it's just not there. There are far too many struggles consuming us all the time, both inner and outer.
And mostly the paths that are presented to us as ways to accept yourself are again another form of sort of material investment or,
Exactly.
well-being, so to speak. The next question is from R. Bhatnagar. Do you think the ethos in which your characters always feel different is particular to India, or is it a class thing that would manifest anywhere in the world? So of course, your
I,
context here is in.
yeah, I think it is particular to India. I would say it's also particular to China. I mean, because in the way literary criticism works these days, I think Chinese readers, and there have been of this novel, have immediately discovered affinities with characters in China, with characters they've already encountered. And when they say that, when I hear that, I feel great joy, because actually the main inspiration behind this book was continuous exposure to Chinese cinema and Chinese literature over the last 25 years or so. And they were the main, I mean, that gave me the idea that one must write about people who've come through you know great deprivation and have experienced unimaginable prosperity, all in the space of 10 or 20 years. And this is an unprecedented transformation. Never in human history have we witnessed so many people undergoing these experiences so rapidly. So I think the experiences, to answer that question, are specific to India and also to China, because these two countries with their massive populations have actually made much more successfully, of course, in China's case. But I think the speed of the transformation there has also been faster. But I think you could compare the two experiences quite profitably.
Are there particular, you mentioned films or writing from China,
Yes,
are there particular?
there's a Chinese film director who's been a huge influence on me called Jia Zhangke. I mean, he's widely regarded as one of the world's great directors today. And a series of films he made about people living in small towns, people becoming prosperous, moving away from their small town origins, betraying their parents, betraying their siblings, betraying their early lovers, inventing themselves with the help of their newfound wealth. All of those themes that are present in Run and Hide, you will find them in his cinema, in his films over a period of like 20 years or so.
I definitely have to watch some of those. That's interesting that you sort of talk about that. There are previous generations in India who've kind of gone through from the bullock cart to the train to the highway, whatever. But this particular 80s, 90s generation has a very different and much faster kind of churn. Yeah.
Definitely
I
faster, and
think,
also different scale, obviously
yeah,
different scale.
yeah, yeah. I think we maybe have time for one more question from Maru Khan, who is asking, the American dream of arriving with $5 in your pocket and making it has been lived by countless immigrants and citizens. Do you feel that despite that, there's some sort of eternal canker in the soul? I guess what they're asking is that dream fulfilling truly? Uh,
Well, it's a dream of a society that has turned its back upon any mode of spirituality or religion, or even, let's not even invoke these grand terms, even on idea of a complex inner life, whereby success is the measure of everything. The success is the measure of your humanity. And I think it's all right for an immigrant society like the United States to uphold that particular worldview, because it's a place that receives tormented people, dispossessed people from different parts of the world and gives them a new chance. It's a mistake for a country like India with its rich, incredibly rich uh, historical experience, with its incredibly rich philosophical and spiritual heritage, to embrace the philosophy of a relatively young and new immigrant society. We've got so much more to offer to the world than some sort of retrofitted American ideology.
There's hints though that towards the end of the novel that there is a bit of an exodus of at least the global elite or liberal left Indians. It's kind of exemplified by Alia, who sort of goes into hiding. Who knows if she retreats into the hinterland of India or elsewhere? But that even places like London, post Brexit, are no longer safe havens for Indians, and that they have to look even further. But this idea of exodus really strikes me particularly. If it's, I don't know if it's something you've thought about a lot.
I did. Oh, definitely, I did. I mean, I felt like the world was becoming again a place where it was going to be impossible to run and hide in. There were no places left to hide in. There were no more proper refuges. There were only inhospitable places everywhere. And if you wanted to run, you had to run a very long distance, and really truly go back to something that is 10 centuries old, like the character at the end in a monastery in a very remote part of Himachal. And even there, traces of the modern world reach him in the form of Outlook magazine and various other news of atrocities. But that's how far you have to go in order to run and hide today.
Well, thank you. I think we have to wrap up the session now, and that's a nice note to end it on. We've been talking about Pankaj Mishra's novel, Run and Hide. I hope everyone reads it. It's very fascinating, full of fascinating insights. Thanks again, Pankaj. Pleasure to speak with you.
Sonal. Likewise.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mishra and Mrs. Shah, for that insightful conversation. And a huge thanks to you, our ever loyal and faithful audience, for joining us today online, and all our partners that have made this festival possible. Our next session online at 7 p.m. is Eyes on You, Big Tech and the Loss of Human Agency, where Dave Eggers is in conversation with Malavika Jayaram. And for those of you in and around Mumbai, remember you can join us for the opening ceremony of the offline festival at the NCPA, along with our exciting debate and book launches. At the NCPA, the festival starts tomorrow, Friday, November 11th, and continues through Saturday, November 12th and Sunday, the 13th, and is also at St. Paul's Institute of Communication Education and the bookstore Tidal Waves, both in Bandra, on Saturday and Sunday. This year, the festival features speakers such as Gitanjali Shri, Christopher Klobel, Audrey McGee, Shashi Tharoor, Gav Patel, and Mahesh Ilkunchwar, among so many other fantastic journalists, poets, writers, and ideologues. Do check out our website, tatalitlive.in, for the schedule and the list of speakers. Thank you for tuning in to Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session is sponsored by Kotak. The festival's social media handle is @Tata Lit Live across all networks. And that concludes our first online session for today. But continue logging on to Tata Literature Live 2022, where you can enjoy turning the page. Happy reading and good evening.